All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Nina Silverstein. I'm a climate associate with the Climate Change Program, and I'm a sophomore at Washington University. First of all, thank you so much for joining the Climate Change Program for our second climate conversation of the fall 2020 semester, which is very exciting. So this conversation will be on climate and environmental justice. So we are going to have a few short presentations interwoven with questions from our participants. So we ask that during the presentation portion of this event that all participants please stay muted. You're free to have your cameras on. As you can see, we have this special view using the special Zoom feature. And so during our question period specifically, you can either raise your hand to ask a question, or you can type your question in the chat and we will try to get to as many as possible. To raise your hand, it's a little complicated, but if you click on participants and then click on raise hand on the bottom right, you should be good. And we should be notified that you have raised your hand. Additionally, all of our panelists have been spotlighted, as you can see, and but you have to make sure if you want to see only the panelists, you have to be on the speaker view. So if you want to change your view from to the speaker view, you can go to the top right, and then you should just see the people who are spotlighted and not all of the participants. Yeah, and we ask that all participants stay muted unless you raise your hand, and I can call on you to ask your question to our wonderful panelists. So we are joined by four incredible panelists. So I first want to thank all of them for joining us. It really means a lot to the Climate Change Program. So I'd love for you all to introduce yourselves. So I'm going to start with Leah Clyburn.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Nina. Thank you all for inviting us here today. Yes, my name is Leah Clyburn. I am the Beyond Coal National Organizer with the Sierra Club. I focus the work around environmental justice and that conversation really and how our environment and how we treat our environment impacts our day-to-day lives, especially on the marginalized. So,
yeah. Thank you so much, Leah. Next, we have Professor Christine Akanga.
Hi, thank you, Nina, for the introduction, and thank you to the Climate Program for the invitation. My name is Christine Akanga. I am an assistant professor of public health at the Brown School here at Washington University in St. Louis. And my training is in environmental health sciences and epidemiology, and my work focuses on the impact of environmental exposures on health outcomes. So I'm looking at exposures of where you live, where you work, and where you play, and how that can influence chronic disease outcomes. I will say, like, studying environmental and occupational factors are challenging because they're often intertwined with larger social, organizational, and cultural issues. So in terms of my work, yes, I do a lot of field sampling, environmental modeling, biomonitoring, GIS. But I think my work is also important because it includes qualitative methods. So it's important to include the voices of stakeholders and understanding some of these issues. So I will stop there, but I think it's really important in terms of promoting health for all to just promote healthy environments where we live, where we work, and where we play.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Next, we have Maisha Johnson. Sorry, Maisha, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Good. Yeah. Okay. Awesome.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Maisha Johnson. I'm the Tenant Rights Coordinator with Dutchtown South Community Corporation. It is important that we realize that the climate can change the way of living that we live in our homes. Our homes are our sacred place and where we feel safe and would like to be stress free. But with the climate change, there tends to be a breakdown in the foundation, which also cause housing insecurities for folks. And they need to know that they have rights within a contract for a landlord. So another piece that I do is teach tenants their what their rights are and how to utilize them while in a contract with a landlord. So all those things intertwine with the environmental justice piece as well, because how the housing crisis is a big piece of the injustice that Black and Brown communities tend to face before COVID, during COVID, and it will be even a bigger crisis after.
Thank you so much, Maisha. I think that's a really important starting message. And finally, I'd like to introduce Emmeline Giles.
Hey everyone, thanks again for having me. I feel really honored to be in the presence of these awesome organizers here, and of course, Professor Kenga. I am the environmental justice organizer with a small grassroots organization called Metropolitan Congregations United. I work directly with congregations, their members, and community groups around environmental justice issues. A big mission of our organization is to help mobilize and organize members and residents that are most impacted by the issues that they want to move and change, and with the whole, end goal of actually impacting and changing policy. And we do that by organizing folks around campaigns and actions. It's not traditional like policy work. It's really through people power. And a big focus of my work is working directly with Black and Brown communities. Right now I'm focusing on Jennings in the 27th Ward. A big thing that I recognized when I'm actually originally from California, and I worked in environmental justice out in the Bay Area. When I came to St. Louis, environmental justice was not really a well understood term just 2 years ago. So it really warms my heart and makes me so excited and fired up that this is becoming such a big, and understood and well understood movement in St. Louis. And that's really what I'm hoping I can support, and really to lift up folks of color are really who inherently lead the environmental justice movement. And so that's why my work is focused around, supporting Black and Brown communities. And, some of the things that I've just noticed is just what is environmental justice? What does that even mean? It's a huge umbrella term. So just a big portion of my work is education around that and advocacy, but it's also what are the issues that are happening in the communities right now that, people want to address? And that's what we do. We work around what folks want to address, what's being impacted. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, the specifics around that work. And how it shows up right now.
Awesome, thank you so much. So we are going to get started. Before I do that, I just want to say that we are using this Zoom feature. We're trying out a few new special things, so there might be a few bumps in the road, but we will get through them. And we're so grateful that all of you guys are here to join us, and I'm so grateful that we get to be joined by all these fabulous panelists. So to get started, I have a guiding question that I'm going to ask the panelists, and then they're going to talk a little bit, and then we'll have some time for questions after this short presentation. So my guiding question is, would you, panelists, would you please explain the history of environmental and climate justice in the United States and in St. Louis? So I think Professor Akinga is going to share her screen if she's able.
Yeah, sure. I'm the professor on this panel here, so I guess I have to start with a brief lecture. So if you all would indulge me here. Okay, and how's that? Is everyone good? Everyone can see it? Okay, so I just wanted to give a brief introduction, a brief history of environmental justice here in the United States. And first, environmental justice is the response to environmental racism. And environmental racism is, whether by conscious design or by institutional neglect, these are, actions or decisions that result in a disproportionate exposure of people of color to environmental hazards and environmental health burdens. So that's a general definition of environmental racism. And I wanted to start off with that definition. The environmental justice movement, it really emerged in the 1980s, but you can trace its origins back to the 1960s. So one of the first events in which African Americans mobilized was in the late 60s, Martin Luther King. In environmental health, we consider him one of the earliest environmental justice advocates. So he was investigating, he was in Memphis in 1968, investigating an environmental justice incident. And he was advocating for better working conditions and pay for striking Memphis sanitation workers. So some of you who are familiar with the history of Dr. King, this is where he was assassinated. So, he was one of our earliest environmental justice advocates, advocating for environmental justice and worker rights. One of the earliest cases in 1979 is a case in Houston where, you had a middle-class, predominantly African-American neighborhood, and the local waste company decided to place a landfill in their neighborhood. They, by all, measures, this is not the place where you would place a landfill. And so the residents of this neighborhood thought that this was because of their race. They ended up suing the waste company. Unfortunately, they lost their lawsuit, but this was one of the first lawsuits to challenge the sitting of a waste facility under civil rights law. So those are some of the early events of the environmental justice movement. I'd say the beginning of the movement where we see this term environmental racism is in Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. And this is when the state decides to place a landfill in a mostly African-American and mostly rural community. And this touches off one of the largest civil rights protests since Martin Luther King in 1968. African-Americans from all over the country, over 500 environmentalists and civil rights advocates were arrested in Warren County, protesting the sitting of this landfill in this neighborhood. This is considered the catalyst of the environmental justice movement, what happened in Warren County in 1982. So these are the events. These are up here is a picture on the right of protesters literally laying on the road trying to block some of the dump trucks from entering the community. This is when the term environmental racism was coined. And this, as I mentioned, was really the catalyst for the movement. Based on what happened in Warren County, the government decided to look at what was going on in terms of the sitting of hazardous waste sites. And so they conducted a study in 1983 and looked at the 8 southeastern states in the US. And they found that although African-Americans made up only about 20% of the residents of the region, more than approximately 75% of the hazardous waste facilities were placed in Black neighborhoods. Often people would argue, well, we're not really placing these waste sites in neighborhoods because of their race. The land is cheap, so it's really, an income issue. So they tried to argue that it wasn't really a race issue. And so in 1987, a follow-up report looked at the relationship between race, income, and where these hazardous waste facilities were placed. And they found that even after adjusting for income, race was more of a factor in the placing of these hazardous waste facilities than any other of the factors that they looked at. This report was published in 1987, and a follow-up report was published 20 years later in 2007. And unfortunately, we saw the same patterns. We saw the same association between race and the sitting of these hazardous waste facilities. So this is what happens in the 80s, and the environmental justice movement, I would argue, is the response to the environmental racism that, you know, the movements of the 80s. And towards the end of the 80s, people began, the term environmental justice was coined. And in 1991, this was a big event in DC where African-American civil rights advocates, environmental justice advocates, indigenous advocates, they had a summit in Washington, D.C., the first National People of Color Summit, where they drafted the principles of environmental justice. And if I have it here, there were 17 principles of environmental justice that they drafted at this summit. And you can see kind of the preamble of these principles. And so really the movement began to gain steam. The Congressional Black Caucus got involved. The NAACP started to take notice of environmental justice issues. And in response, okay, so here's a picture from the summit. In response, the Environmental Protection Agency began to respond. So they convened a working group where for the first time, well, not the first time, but it was good that they started to bring in social scientists to look at some of these issues in environmental injustice and inequities. In 1992, the EPA forms their Office of Environmental Equity. And you know, in the response to criticism over this term equity versus justice, they changed the name of their office to Justice. You know, their argument was equity means we'll just spread the hazards equally, whereas justice is more of, you know, everyone has a right to a safe and healthy environment that is free from life-threatening hazards. So after all of these events in the early 90s, an executive order, President Bill Clinton declared an executive order in which he ordered that all federal agencies must consider environmental justice in their decisions. And what ended up happening is that the EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment, meaning that all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, must be treated equally with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of these laws, regulations, and policies, and meaningful involvement. So, you know, the events of the 80s where people are just placing landfills in communities without seeking any input, that has to stop. That the potentially affected population has to have an opportunity to participate in decision-making processes, that their participation has to be taken into account of the regulatory agency's decision, and that, you know, these their participation and their comments are considered in the decision-making processes. So there are two parts of environmental justice according to the EPA. There's fair treatment and meaningful involvement. So here, again, I just wanted an overview of the events, and really, you know, in the last, you know, almost 40 years now, you've seen the events of the movement. And, you know, I've seen that, especially with climate change, we're really beginning to think more about environmental justice issues, as we'll discuss during this panel with climate change and what's happening with COVID. But I wanted to just end my presentation here by highlighting a recent study that we did looking at air pollutants in the St. Louis metro area. And I think Emmeline mentioned before that, you know, I was surprised, you know, I came here about 5 years ago, and I hadn't really seen a lot of work looking at the relationship between socio-demographic factors and environmental hazards here in the region. And our region is very interesting. You know, we've got 15 counties, 2 states, and you know, a very diverse population. And what we did in a recent study is we looked at the relationship between, you know, racial segregation and income segregation and air pollution in the area. Unfortunately, St. Louis is one of the top most segregated cities in the United States. And you can see here, looking at the non-white population, so the darker color of, I guess, brown here indicates the greater percentage of non-white populations. And here, unfortunately, poverty is a little bit more spread out in the region here on the right. But we saw briefly, just to highlight our results, when we looked at the relationship between some of these air toxics, we saw maps that were very similar to our maps of looking at racial and income segregation in the region. And we saw significant associations between Black-white segregation and being exposed to these air toxics, and also income segregation and being exposed to these air toxics. So as we've seen in the studies that have been published, 25 years ago, we're seeing environmental justice issues here in the St. Louis metro area. So I will stop there and give you, my co-panelists, an opportunity to contribute, or if Nina wants to move on to the next question, she can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really, really helpful, very informative. Yeah, let's take a few minutes to see if any other panelists would like to contribute. And then any participants can type their questions in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and I will see if, and then I will answer you. So, but let's see, any panelists, if any of you would like to add to that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, if it's okay, I just really wanted to take the second and, Professor King, that was awesome. Thank you so much for that. I mean, I learned some tidbits too that I didn't know before, so that was very helpful. I just wanted to lift up that, to always remember that we were not the first folks on this land. I think it's important to lift up that we aren't the first folks to fight for it either. And just to acknowledge, I'm not really well versed in the indigenous that were here before us. I know some of the tribes, Osage, Miami, even the Iroquois, Sioux, just to acknowledge that they were fighting for this land back when they lived here, and they cultivated the land and they lived amongst nature in a different way than we do nowadays. So always lifting that up. And I also want to lift up that even though when I came here 2 years ago, and Professor Kinga mentioned too, that not a lot of work seems to be being done around environmental justice at that time, or being on folks' tongues, it was still happening in St. Louis. There is a history of the fight here, and I think it's important to acknowledge that and to remember that. And maybe this is another wave of organizing, and I'm really excited about it, but it was happening, even back in the 70s, when we coined Earth Day, for example. It's a really good article that kind of talks about this group called the St. Louis Metropolitan Black Survival Committee that existed and organized each other and their community around environmental racism that was occurring, and that had been occurring, of course, in St. Louis. And it was a collective of Black residents advocating for their environmental concerns affecting Black communities. They organized a guerrilla street theater program, freaking awesome, called Black Survival, and a collage of skits. So they integrated art as a way to express what was going on, to bring folks into the fold in a really beautiful way. And it basically had short skits designed to raise awareness, to educate audiences about poor living conditions that Maisha will speak about, soon, about housing, environmental hazards impacting poor communities in St. Louis. And it was really to push city politicians to address something that we're still dealing with today: lead poisoning. Lead poisoning not only in our paint, but our soil. So if you talk about, growing food and urban agriculture, we don't know what soil is non-toxic or not. And then lead poisoning in our school water systems. And it was an issue just back in 2016 we actually had to close down a bunch of water fountains, about 74 buildings in our St. Louis Public School District. 82 of those water sources were found to have dangerously high levels of lead. This was only a couple years ago, folks. So like, you know, just keeping all of that in context to continuing this fight and lifting it up. We have been doing this. It's not new. Let's you know, come together again and keep fighting for this.
Yeah, I like to also piggyback onto that too, with just also saying like, yeah, especially with thank you, Professor Christine, on all that you shared, because I think it's very important that, you know, the reason for that segregation that's happened is important, right? We know the folks who are from St. Louis know about Red Line. We know about the Del Mar Divide, right? And how all this is very much so intentional. And you know, what is the coin phrase that they use, that folks have used through to keep us all continuously divided, is that what's happening in rural Mo is being ignored, just like and needs more focus. But then folks in the city are saying no, that they need more focus because it's what's happening in the city. But at the end of the day, what's happening is both sides are getting hustled over, right, and kept separate. And we've seen the actual come together back in the 80s, as Professor Christine has lifted up, as well as Emmeline, here in Missouri, where an organization called Organization of Black Struggle, along with the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, joined with and the Rainbow Coalition came to join with them, right? They were already coming together to address the issues of their lands, farmers' lands being taken from them. It was already happening here in North City. And so the connect that the two organizations identified that it was happening again to rural farmers and their private owned farmland that was happening out in rural Mo. And so, though, of course, you know, the powers that be, they unfortunately did not win that fight, but it was that example of how environmental injustice is effective on everybody. And so if it's allowed to happen, it happens first, almost like a test dummy, right? If it happens first on Black and Brown communities, then it's seeing how it can happen on other communities, such as, you know, white and marginalized folks as well.
Thank you so much.
I did want to add one other thing, if I may. I also, Professor King brought up, you know, that she would argue that the environmental justice movement was in response to environmental racism. I also tend to also add, when I speak about environmental justice, I also think that it was in response to environmentalism, like the movement of environmentalism. And we can acknowledge that as well, and the history of, you know, conservation and preservation, and our understanding of what environment is, to understand the nuances that our environment is all around us. It is our air we breathe on the daily. You know, Professor King says, where we live, work, and play, as opposed to where we go camp, where we go to the river. You know, that is also obviously part of our environment. But when we think of it more literally close to home in our backyards, what does that mean when we're talking about environmental justice then? What does that mean for rights of all folks to have a clean environment to live, work, and play, to be able to go back in my backyard and grow food for myself and not have to worry about, you know, the previous plot, you know, behind my house was, you know, the house was buried underneath because it's a vacant lot now. And so maybe there's asbestos and lead in it, you know, all of that. And then top on that, you know, just thinking about vacancy, you know, how big our vacancy issues here are in particular parts of our city and our county, and understanding that layer to it too. So it just, there's so much to it. There's so many nuances to it.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of those answers. Very, very informative. So yeah, thank you so much. I think we're going to move on. We have gotten a few questions. I think I'd like to address them a little bit later. I think it would be good if we could discuss about environmental justice and climate justice today, and then we can address some of those questions that have been asking more about today. So I saw them, and I will definitely try and address as many as I can. So my next guiding question is, as I just said, what examples do you see of the need for environmental justice and climate justice today? You can talk about how it pertains to St. Louis specifically, and also more broadly. So I know that Leah had to pop off for a bit, but if either Maisha or Emmeline, if one of you guys would like to go, that would be great to kind of start the conversation.
I can speak on that. Hi, everyone. So, the current pandemic that we're in right now is so unpredictable, and the results of it is a massive U.S. housing crisis, which itself can be traced to a global economic imbalance that could have been prevented. How things have been put in place prior to the moratorium, the first moratorium we had. As we all know the affordable supply is already low, and the government initiatives are minimal. The gap of affordable housing, we need to fill why it continues to widen. If left alone, we know that these issues can cause a bigger problem, such as more homeless camps, which we call tent camps, job loss, poverty, hunger, and social isolation. All of these include the inequities that Black and Brown communities or neighborhoods continue to see. Um, the lead in the home, you're supposed to feel safe in your home, and we're running into that. A lot of folks who are used to being in the working class but has lost their jobs during the time are starting to see that if they are renters, that the landlord has been or continues to not properly take care of their buildings. And a lot of the inspections are going through. So we've been working on who do we hold accountable. So while the tenants or renters are advocating for themselves, that there is another department that would stand with that tenant or with the folks that's organizing the tenant, how to address the issue with the landlord. We're seeing a lot of asthma issues popping up due to the climate change. And so when the climate changes, it affects the home because the moist in the building and the walls starts to form mold. The paint starts deteriorating, and the children pick it up, and the little ones eat it. So there's the lead. The lead is also in the water, as Emmeline spoke about when they had to shut down the schools. When they tested the water in those schools that they had to shut down, the numbers were almost equivalent to Flint. The numbers were almost equivalent to Flint. So why wasn't that spoken about? In the homes, if they do demolition and they tear a home down and it's been there since the 1800s, 9 times out of 10, it has lead in it too. So when those kids go play in that vacant lot, or when they have to take the trash out and they have to cross that lot, they're contracting the lead particles that is left in that soil. So there is many, many ways that the climate comes into effect with housing or illness in these neighborhoods. I know when I moved in my home, I didn't even have a recycling bin, a waste bin, or a trash bin to dispose of my waste. I had to call for these items, for the bins to be put out, the dumpsters to be put out and back. And once I did that, I noticed that other families from around the corner or other parts of the neighborhood were coming and putting their trash in my bin. And that's an issue to me. If there's nowhere for other folks to put their waste, where does it go? It goes on the side of the building, it goes in the alleys, it goes on our streets, it goes in the kids' playgrounds. These are things that we need to start working on, and habits that we need to implement into our life to secure ourselves and our family and our community. We've noticed that a lot of folks are also scared to say when they're having breathing issues and where they're caused from. We don't we don't want to say they came from our home because we don't want anyone to think that our home isn't safe. And we don't, a lot of renters, I've heard stories that they don't want to complain because they don't want to look like a bad renter. From immigrants, I heard, I don't want to look like the bad citizen. And they don't want to say that there's bad representation as landlords in their culture, because they usually rent from individuals in their culture. And these are stigmas that we need to break, because we need to start advocating and speaking up for ourselves. That's where the power is, in your voice. These changes that we talk about can be made once we come together and make these changes. Emmeline talk about growing food. We can't grow the food if the land that we want to grow on has lead in it. So this testing needs to be done prior to if you want to start growing food in that area. If you want to build on some land, have the land tested to make sure that this doesn't come into the foundation of your home and affect your family. If you see mold, if you have a breakdown in the foundation, there's holes, the paint is starting to come apart. Um, the faucet, you notice particles coming out the water with it, or the air, when you turn on the air, you can smell chemicals. You need to reach out to the organizations that work on this. So one is EHOC, the Equal Housing Opportunity Council. They work real good on addressing these issues. Also, Arch City Defenders, they're good at addressing those issues. Legal services, they're starting to step in and address more issues surrounding environmental complaints. So you're not alone, and you don't have to keep living in this situation. I've experienced folks saying, well, I've never had this happen to me before. None of this, no one was prepared for COVID. And oh, what if the windows need to be fixed, or if my home needs to be rehabbed during COVID? Like, there are items that we're having to purchase to prevent ourselves from catching COVID. But if a family member someone has to work, the bills have to be paid, and that's the biggest issue, is that landlords are starting to harass tenants during this process of the pandemic. And there's bare minimum resources. So they put the CARES Act money out there. It's almost evaporated, it's like they're running out of funds. They're running out of funds, and we don't know if more is going to be allocated. Folks they're scared, and that needs to be in discussion, and it needs to be pushed how important it is to implement funds surrounding housing, because a lot of folks are experiencing housing insecurities at this time and feel like, oh, I've never had this issue, so I don't know who to turn to. And it's really just having a conversation with someone that may have a relationship with someone that has those resources. We will never know if you don't talk about it. And know that you're not alone going through these things. There are others, but we have to start talking amongst each other. And that's where the solution for change comes, with whether it's housing, the agriculture part of growing food, the climate part of, like they did the fight, stopping the landfill coming into their community. I mean, trying to stop it. Not all fights are winnable, but know that when your voice is spoken, someone heard you. So never feel like you have no power. Your power is your voice. And it only takes one voice at times to move a whole community, a whole state, a whole, to move the change. It can begin with you.
Thank you so much, Maisha. Um, that was, I think, such an important message that we can all take home from this event. I'd love to give Leah some time to discuss specifically climate justice. Um, she does a lot of really, really important work within that. So I was just so you know, we were talking about the examples of environmental and climate justice today, and I'm sure you can go off of that. So.
Yeah, no, thank you. And what a follow up behind Maisha. Yeah, I am actually very honored and have the privilege to actually work with all the women here in some capacity, because it is about really addressing this topic in a diversified way. When we talk about all the issues that's happening in relationship to climate, we need to look solely into who are our, what we say at the Sierra Club, the super polluters, right? Who are our prime suspects? And we really need to look at our industries, right? Who are the ones that are coal reliant, and how can we really lift up our voices as people to really hone in and say, look, these resources are no longer necessary to use, and we are demanding that you use alternatives like wind and solar. At the Sierra Club, we have folks who work with community members all over the world. And so when we talk about the demand for a change in regards to climate, it's affecting us from our island folks, right? And with the high rides and our tides to heat migration, right? That we see even now over in Europe with a lot of folks that are coming from Africa and India, taking boats, risking their lives, like folks even here in Americas, where people are crossing the border just to avoid the constant heat, right? And if we do not, right, influence our companies, our universities to divest from the use of coal, which is our prime contributor to the breakdown of our ozone and causing of the greenhouse effects that we are experiencing, then even here in Missouri, where there was a study that was done on smog, right, and they said, but by 2060, I'm just trying to make sure I get this right. By 2060 in Missouri and throughout the Midwest, people will start experiencing weeks that we will label or call wet bulbs. These are 10 to 15 days in which will be identified as higher levels of humidity. Now we know in Missouri, once it could be 80 degrees and be like, woo, anywhere else. But if it's 80 degrees in the summertime, we know you can't breathe out there. You already can't go out there, right? If you had your hair curled, go ahead and expect it to be straight. If you took a shower, go ahead and acknowledge you're going to sweat in like 5.5, right? And this is because, we are the Midwest. We're water people. We are still surrounded by water, right? And so the mixture of all the pollen plus, plus the humidity, plus everything else that flies in our air, with the exhaust, with the high levels of pollution from 4 of our largest. We have one of the largest coal plants in the region, right? If we don't start getting a hold of this now, it's going to get too dangerous for us to go outside. Now, I enjoy going down by the river. That's kind of our saying, right? I grew up here, and that's the thing you do. You go to the river. If it's too hot, you go to the river. Find any river, you just go by it, right? You stick your feet in it. That's what you do. We have beautiful parks, beautiful lands. We will not be able to enjoy even our most treasured gifts, like the Missouri River, if we don't get a hold on this. When we look at nationally, we can look at hurricanes. I mean, I was part of AmeriCorps when Katrina happened. They say the hurricane that Louisiana is experiencing right now is comparative to Katrina. Katrina was unprecedented. What's happening, right? And they're experiencing 5. This is their 5th one. Okay, like that's a problem, right? Last time we were down there, we met with some indigenous folks from New Orleans, and they were speaking about how the actual outline of their shores is actually false. Not only has it been receded, but then it had to be replaced due to climate change. That is a problem. If you even go into their swamps, because of the high levels of salt in the water nowadays, the mosquitoes aren't even there, which is odd. Right? Like 1 + 1 is supposed to be 2. That's there's something wrong there, right? When we continue to look at climate change and its effects, we look at the increasing long-standing existence of fire seasons, right? California still on fire. It's October, right? Like we're about to come to the end of October. What's going on? And then we can even look at just like earlier this week with Oklahoma having its first freeze to the power. They had a power outage because of such. That wasn't a thing before, right? And even if we look even back in our own backyard where we have just, what was it, last week, right? When they were talking about St. Louis needing to look out for our own selves for a fire, right? For a potential fire to happen due to heat. That's not normal. And it's okay to start saying these things are not normal. And we have to start getting curious and demanding why, like clear, defined answers, and not just, complacent ones. We can no longer sit back and be complacent. When we look at the whys and why this is happening, we have to look at who's benefiting, who are the benefactors from these from our conditions, right? And so and when we look at environmental justice, a standpoint along with, right, the changes in our environment, it starts on the marginalized communities, it starts on the outskirts of the communities, right? So when we talk about air pollution here in Missouri, right, we have one of the largest. Ameren is our utility, right? And in their 4 utilities, their largest coal reliant plant is Labadie, right? Coal-fired plant. This is the largest carbon polluter in the United States that is operating on coal and within our region. It is considered one of the top three, right? Top 4 within the region. It is considered the 14th in the nation out of all utilities, right? Now, it's not, they're only 14, okay? Let's be very clear. They're 14 only because they're competing with other utility companies that service multiple states, multiple cities. So 14 for one state, that's a problem, right? And we could do something about it, right? Because of the work that happened in the past, all the way up to the work and the partnerships with the EPA and the work with the Sierra Club and all of our other partners that we've listed throughout, and we can continue, the list goes on and on throughout the years. We've been able to contribute to the retirement of already 10 coal plants, right? This is 10.7 million tons of SO2 a year that we all were able to be a part of reducing. In 10 years, This is comparable to 2.1 million cars and their SO2 impact. This is 44,000 tons of SO2, 15,000 tons of NO2, right? So with all of these numbers, just kind of make sure I give you all the facts, you know. We're talking about, so nitrogen oxide is the NO2, and that's the small contributor. So when we're talking about smog, we're talking about asthma, right? We're talking about, are we able to breathe? Are we able to see? Are we able to congregate outdoors? And then we're talking about SO2. We are talking about one of the adjutants to asthma and other respiratory issues. And we, through the environmental racism report, if you all have not seen that, that came out, wow, was that last year or the year before? We lift up the stories of Black and Brown community members and our children and how this is affecting our children. The children are our future, right? And the increasing numbers that we find comparable to their white counter. And so if we can slow it down, the production of coal, and really get our utilities like Ameren to reduce their use and look into renewable resources like wind and solar, we can not only preserve and protect the most marginalized, which is our youth and our elderly, right? But we can also start looking at a more investment in infrastructure and education. We can also start looking at opportunities of how do we conserve and value land, and the value of people who live on that land, right? And also bring more morale into our community. But that won't happen if we're going to allow ourselves to be dumped on by not just the air pollution, not just the water pollution, because it's affecting both air and water, but then also the land that we live on. We can no longer allow ourselves to be bought out, but we need to be now brought into the conversation to invoke the change that we need to see. And so one of the call outs and opportunities that everybody has is to actually let that be known that it's what you want to do. And because the EPA, when they hear that, they actually will apply that, especially to Ameren. If Ameren gets like a letter from any and all of us, especially for those of us who are part of large organizations like WashU or SLU or Barnes, and any other business-owned entity and church.
Leah, thank you so much for that. That was really wonderful and very informative, and also, yeah, really kind of shows how we have a lot of more work to do. Emmeline, I'd love to give you, if you have just like a minute, kind of, because I'd love to move on to kind of talk about the impact of COVID as well, along with climate justice and environmental justice. But Emmeline, if there's something that you would briefly like to add, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly that, Leah mentioned the environmental racism report. I highly recommend reading that, going through it. It's not too long. It's really, understandable, and it really lays out some of the major environmental injustices that have been occurring and are currently really big issues in St. Louis. If you want to learn more about that and really understand the stories behind that, and how the biggest part of environmental justice is that it disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities, right? And so, of course, this is very like St. Louis urban focused. It still is a really good start to kind of starting to learn about, things that were lifted up already by Maisha around mold. Leah's talking about asthma. There's a chapter on blood poisoning. It also talks about energy efficiency. We don't really think about that, but energy inefficiency is actually an environmental injustice. And a lot of our Black and Brown communities be thinking about old infrastructure, old buildings, and the high, insane utility bills that folks have to pay every month. We have no idea. It's like these stories that we hear and we're like, no way, I can't believe that. And so like, where is the justice in that and the fights that these folks have to go through? And it's always like, oh, well, you have to speak to this person. Oh, speak to them. Or no one takes responsibility, and it continues to fall on residents who have they don't have a voice, even if they try sometimes. And so we're trying to lift those voices up and support those with resources and whatever we can do as organizers, and definitely need everyone's help. This is a huge fight. And then I also wanted to lift up, talked about food apartheid. If folks haven't heard of that term before, if you've heard of food justice, or food equity, food access, right? Understanding that when we talk about a food desert, a really good understanding that we don't use that term as much anymore, because deserts are naturally occurring ecosystems, are they not? Is the food issues that we have in parts of our city and our county, is that a naturally occurring ecosystem? No, it's all not. It's a part of the system. It's been planned. It's been disinvested. And so that's why the term food apartheid really gets at that, and gets at that nuance and the history that we need to understand, why these grocery stores are leaving these certain areas. Because of money, investments, tax write-offs, all those things. It's so political. I think that's the thing that maybe folks might not understand, how political environmental justice is, and in order to fight against it, it's a lot of work, and we need all the hands in. And you'll also notice, just to lift up too, if someone can share, I'll just share the chat too, this quick link directly to the report. But you'll look at the maps. Professor Ikenga showed some maps earlier. Did you see patterns? If you look at this report, just look at the maps. Look at all the patterns, right? Look at all the shaded areas. And obviously we know about Del Mar Divide, but look at parts of South City, North County, North City. Literally every map shows the same patterns. And then you'll go to, other maps about food insecurity, other maps about, low income or lack of access to transportation. What are the trends? What are we seeing here, y'all, right? So just wanted to lift that up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Those are really, really important issues. So we are going to move on. I'd like to bring in COVID. And then after that, I think we're gonna just culminate with questions. So please feel free to type any questions you have in the chat, but we're gonna briefly just talk about the intersection of COVID with all of this. So my guiding question is that COVID-19 has had an enormous impact on all of our lives. We've all been impacted by it. And it has revealed the very long persisting injustices many people, especially people of color, face. Could you please, and any one of you guys can start, but it would be great if you guys could address the connection between COVID and environmental and climate justice, because they all intersect with each other.
Yeah, so I'll start and just go ahead and punt it to my dear ones here with me. When you look at the map, right? So Sierra Club joined with Harvard study, and they did a research around the impacts of COVID and environmental justice. And what we found was basically those maps that Professor Christine shared earlier, and that are shared throughout the environmental racism report, and just see those areas brighten, right? Specifically, our Midwest areas are even more impacted, right? And it is because of the fact that what we're seeing is an increase of all the pre-existing issues, like what Maisha said earlier, right? How these things exist now, and we already know there's going to be worse on the other end of COVID. During what we found is that also, during this time of COVID, I had partnered with Emmeline as well as the Missouri immigrant and refugee advocates to address and try to assist community members throughout the St. Louis region in getting access to resources, because resources become more and more limited. They're already limited, right? For various folks in St. Louis, um, because of where they live. But now we're identifying that it is also because of the color of their skin, or even if you're an immigrant or refugee, right? There was more, we found that more resources were on basically one side of the area and not on the other. And then now what's happening, because our city, because our state, because our nation was not necessarily not ready, not just not ready, right? But did not allow itself the time that it needed to really assess the situation that we are in. We are finding, from what Maisha was speaking on, we are finding folks being, their home, their living situation was already not good, right? We're finding those living situations to worsen, where people are being forced out, right? During the time in which people were not supposed to, there was supposed to be a hold on evictions, people were being evicted for other reasons, for lack of a better term, trumped up reasons, right? And it was all justifiable. And it's only justifiable because there was no due process, right? Because the court system was not set up in a way that was ready for COVID. So when people could not represent themselves, therefore they could not be seen. And if they could not be seen, then they didn't have a voice. What is that? Right? Like, I remember us being Maisha and I sitting up late, like trying to figure out what is this. And we worked really hard with the Housing Defense Collective here in St. Louis to address these issues and really bring it in a very public way, to even working with Emmeline and working over in Jennings and the 27th Ward, and hearing the call to address the need for food, like how Emmeline was talking about food apartheid, resources, right? Healthy food, right? Not from marts, right? Not from even our grocery stores. You can't trust what's in these grocery stores because it comes secondary. The food you could find over in Webster Groves is the expired food that you would go then find over in North City, and that is shameful. That is shameful. And it will increase. It will get worse. It worsens, right? And then if we just go look, we hone all the way out and just look at our climate as alone in Missouri, right? Everybody knows about allergies in Missouri. If you want to talk, you don't even got to go to a doctor if you want to know about allergies. Just get to know your neighbor, right? Everybody knows about allergies here because we grow up with it, right? We're in the middle. But if you are facing also with COVID, right? We've seen that folks with pre-existing conditions, right, who are faced with COVID, come to their unfortunate demise, right? And if you already have upper respiratory issues like asthma, we know that those effects can be dire. And then just last week, they finally put a starting down, like the minimum that one could be expected to pay in relationship to their health bills and costs is $20,000 due to hospital fees. That's the minimum. Now you're talking about a furloughed family, right? You're talking about potentially losing, so you're furloughed, that means you're not at work, and people were taken off of furlough, and some people didn't even get assistance at all, right? And which Maisha can definitely talk a little bit more about that, because she had a lot of people call her during this time around, what do I do? I don't have any finances to cover this. So then we're talking about furloughed families. We're talking about affected families at the same time because of high levels of folks who have 1 out of 5 in a household has asthma in the house. And then we're talking about poor living conditions already that you're living in because of mold, because of inefficient housing. So that means higher bills, electric bills, because you are not able to, because people are at home all day, right? And then you don't have healthy food access. Oh wait, and then your electricity is about to get shut off because that is about to roll back out again, right? And what does one do? Now we're back to with where the very beginning with Professor Christine was talking about the mental health of folks, right? So all this puts us in a very insecure position as a city and as a state, because what my last conversation I had with some folks over in Columbia, Missouri, said it's happening there too. So this is not an isolated incident, but it is very much so honed in on the Black, brown, and marginalized poor neighborhood individuals here in Missouri.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was very valuable. And I'd love for Professor Ikenga to give a few more comments because she does a lot of work with this. And then we're going to move on to questions because I do want to make sure we can address what some people are asking about.
Yeah, sure. So I can comment on, the research on climate change and COVID. And right now, we don't have any direct evidence between or that climate change has influenced the spread of COVID. But when you really think about it, climate change is kind of altering how the different species interact with each other. So COVID, it's a zoonotic, or we think it's a zoonotic disease, animal to human transmission, right? So as the planet has heated up, animals are headed to places where they weren't before, and we're coming into contact with animals that we normally wouldn't have come into contact with. So all the root causes of climate change are also kind of the root causes of what we think we'll see is an increase in these zoonotic diseases. So deforestation, loss of habitat, causing animals to potentially, have contact with humans, large livestock farms, so this demand for animal meat, all the root causes of climate change are potentially the root causes of COVID. You guys may have heard of recent studies finding associations between air quality, air pollution and COVID. And there have been studies here in the US and then some really good studies out of China seeing associations between long-term air pollution and worse COVID outcomes. And, if you're probably familiar with how, we're collecting COVID data, it's not the best data, but, we're seeing some really strong associations, and it kind of makes sense, all of our pre-existing conditions, heart attack, stroke, diabetes, high blood pressure, there are associations between those conditions and air pollution. Right, so we see associations between those pre-existing conditions. What's really interesting about these studies that have come out is that we're seeing that air pollution may influence the severity of COVID. And if we're coming back to our topic of thinking about environmental justice, if you've got low-income communities and communities of colors that have these disproportionate exposures, then potentially you're seeing the disproportionate impact of air pollution leading to disproportionate or more severe outcomes. So again, a lot of this work is really early and the data is not the best that it should be, but it's some really interesting work coming out thinking about the relationship between climate change, air quality, air pollution, and COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they all intersect, which is, I think, really crucial. And the first question actually kind of does have to do with intersection of all of these ideas. How do we balance scientific and social situations to achieve this environmental justice? So, in other words, how can we bring these two different spheres together to create these long-lasting solutions?
So I would say it's what we do, right? It's pretty much what we do, right? So for going to those who are like our policymakers, those who are our decision makers over this conversation, really coming with the science along with the lived experience is definitely valuable as an understatement. But then also really sharing the stories and the information with the people who have actually the most power is us, right? So sharing and building relationship and reminding folks that we're the ones who voted folks in and we're the ones that can vote folks out. And we're the ones that purchase these resources, and we're the ones that can also help craft what it is we need. You know, there's not too long, well, it was long ago, thank God, because I would never want to see Black Tuesday, but Black Tuesday was a thing that happened here in St. Louis. And our mayor was, what was it, Tucker, right? And it was we were using soft coal then. And it was the people, right, who came together along with the Boy Scouts and everybody else who said, we can't do this no more. It was angry mothers most of all, right? Because they got tired of cleaning up their children and seeing soot minute after minute in their homes. We can do that too, right? We could do that. And so it's reminding people of the science, equip them with what they already know and supporting it with the science to let them know that they're not crazy, and building relationships with each other so that they can move together as a unit to be like no more. And then also using the science to help support our champions, and reminding others who just might want to question it to be like, look, here's the facts, and here's policies that you can write according to that. And if you don't, we know, right? We know that our government works, and we can vote you out. Here's your pink slip. Do what you do. So I will.
Yeah, absolutely. Maisha, would you like to add something?
Also, it's telling your story, because I told the story about how when I came to St. Louis 2 years later, I was diagnosed with cancer, and then found out that when my dad passed and we did an autopsy, he had cancer. My mom had cancer, and I was like, I thought that maybe the common denominator was the gas smell that I was smelling in the air. And once I told my story, more people came out and told their story in the community. And now there's a lawsuit against the facility that is causing those chemicals to be released into the air. Thank you, Bruce. But yeah, so once you tell your story, as I said, that your voice can be the power to the change. It may not be while you're here on earth, but the ball will start getting rolling because you spoke up about a situation that was happening with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, and that's really important. I don't know if either Professor Akenga or Emmeline, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add, or we can move on to other questions.
I don't want to rock the boat too much, but I have a partner in academia, and I just think that as much as our systems, we're working to change them for the better, I know that academia has their own silos as well, and struggles as an organization with smaller orgs and all that, and money is also a big thing too, and it's been the history of research, who's funding that research project, who's funding that paper, it's really important. And I know politics plays a huge role in research, and so being mindful of that. But at the same time, I have dreams that we could lift up our folks in education and doing research as also community organizers and leaders themselves they're trying to make change in the community, and they're up against odds just like us. So the more I think we can work together and strategize, I think the more power we can have to do it strategically, to do it in a way, of course, we all have fears around our own security, whether, it's financial, whatever, job security, all that stuff, but we got to fight together. This is serious stuff. So I would just add that.
I agree with all three of my co-panelists. I want to say that you cannot achieve environmental justice without addressing social needs. And one of the first things, so I was trained in epidemiology and environmental sciences. I was not trained in environmental justice work. One of the first things I did when I got here to WashU, and actually a fantastic doctoral student who I think is on the chat, Jun Kang, the first thing we did was go out and talk to people. And so he led a fantastic study looking at the environmental health concerns of residents of low-income communities in North St. Louis City and County. And what we found is that, yes, they're concerned about, environmental issues, flooding, asthma issues, access to healthy food, but there are other concerns, particularly in the city. There were concerns about violence. There were concerns about racism. And the work from that study informed my next study, which was the air quality study that I presented earlier in the talk. So I think it's important, I say from the academic perspective, is that I just can't sit here and produce maps. It's important that I understand the needs and the challenges of the communities that we're working in.
And this is like to bring it to full circle, like between honestly, the work that we all do, we could not do without the support of universities like WashU. I honestly learned to spend, I almost was like, I felt like an honorary student last year because I was up there so much. But it is so imperative to be able to have a team and folks that are willing to do not just the research, but on different levels and different scales, right? Like we have various partners who are clear about the policies and all the lawyering that needs to happen to fight on the other side of the conversation. But how do we go about it to deeply educate and equip, right? Because knowledge is power. And once write that statement, once you have it, can no one take it from you, right? And to even talk about, just going out into the community and addressing the issues that the community is facing. Violence, right, is encouraged due to climate change, right? And so something simple as planting more trees can answer so many questions. And how come we're not asking questions, especially in St. Louis City, why don't we have more trees, right? That could cover so many things. So I just want to, I didn't want to leave without having that plug in there too.
Yeah, that's so, you guys all shared such really important comments. And so we have about 10 minutes left. There was one more question. Sorry, I'm kind of balancing all these different screens at the same time. There was, you brought up the high crime rate. Someone was asking what the role environmental issues play with that and how those intersect with each other.
So that goes back to the climate change conversation. That goes back to the greenhouse effects. That goes to the like when one has the inability to cool down, right? Because our summers get hot, right? And if one does not have the ability to cool down, one gets agitated. So if you cannot cool down, and say you also have asthma, right? So now you can't breathe and you can't cool down. Frustration is an understatement, right? And that's also has a triggering effect. And when we don't provide those type of resources, and we don't educate our, say, police department, or to do de-escalation, and or to be trained around mental health, or I don't know, open more mental health facilities around our city like we used to have and no longer have, find creative ways to reinvest in people, then what we have is a dangerous situation, a very of a community of folks that are on the edge. I'm not saying Black, I'm not saying brown, I'm saying community, because it puts us all on edge, right? We are all not safe. When one isn't safe, we are all not safe.
Yeah, I'm veering out of my area expertise here, but the idea is that with warmer temperatures, either people become more irritated and become more aggressive. Also, people are outdoors more, so they're interacting more with each other, so that can lead to more opportunities for conflict. And there's research out there that's seen association between temperature and violent crime. So the idea is that climate change may lead to an increase in crime. Again, outside of my area of expertise, and there have been studies that have shown, the calming effect, the psychological effect of green space, trees. And so, it can, there are influences in the built environment and the natural environment on our emotions and how we interact with each other.
Yeah.
I don't know if this was lifted up. Sorry. Let me know. But just, as a tangible example too, and we mentioned it before, just vacancy, vacancy issues. If you live in a block and you have 5 vacant buildings, let's say 5 more vacant lots, maybe you're the only one who lives on that block and the next person who lives near you is like a block away. I mean, imagine what that can bring to your community. It could bring, there's empty spaces that are crumbling down. Maybe folks are trying to find a place to live, squatting, okay, but it's also not safe. Things are crumbling down on them. And then other activities can be happening though. So that's one way that it can increase violence just in your neighborhood. And then if you have kids in the area, just imagining that's not a supportive playground, right? But it is in essence in their backyard. So what's going to happen otherwise? So those are just that, I just wanted to lift that up too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are all really important points. I'm going to ask one more question and then I think we're going to wrap up this presentation. Professor Ikenga, you might have, this is just a question about WashU, so you might have some sense, but Mandy was wondering, what partnerships do you think WashU is lacking or needs to move forward to continue to engage in environmental justice and climate justice? And anyone is welcome to respond to that as well. If I didn't mean to put you on the spot there.
My answer is I don't know. I'm really excited with what I'm seeing in this talk and what's going on around campus. So I can't answer your question, but I think, this is these conversations are a good start and I'm excited for what's to come.
Yeah, so I can highlight from what some of the things that we're seeing and what that, to what Professor Christine was talking about, like it was happening. But there needs to be more, right? So there is a large community, a diverse community that is a part of a part of WashU, right? That is inclusive of people of color, right? And those voices are not necessarily heard nor seen. And so how do we lift those individuals, those students, and their lived experience, right? Yes, it might be a little difficult. Why? Because the history shows that, maybe WashU didn't really invest at one time. Now, back in the day, WashU was known to be the college for Black folks in St. Louis, but there was a shift at some point. Now, however the answers that be, eventually we're getting back to where things need to be, right? But how do we make sure that we are intentional to be inclusive of the voices of the folks that are coming in from all different parts of this beautiful world we live in, right? But also the folks that are lived here and have the lived experience that can also have a contributing factor. So a lot of your resources are right there at the school, right? So we don't have to go far. That's what I would like to see. And I also know that that's happening too through the various groups that I have the honor to work with on the campus.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for that. So we have just a few more minutes left. I'd love to give you all a chance just to give a few concluding thoughts. You've all shared such really important information, and I know that I have gotten a lot out of this and learned a lot that I had never even considered. So I'm so appreciative of that. And but yes, I'd love to give you all a chance just to do a quick minute to kind of, if you want to conclude anything, send any final messages.
So I would like to, so at the Sierra Club, we are going to continue this fight. Pretty much what we do. And again, like remembering that environmental justice is in relationship with the environment that we live, right? And it's our lived experience and how it's being affected, right? Because there are policies that's being ignored, and there's policies that need to be produced, right? And we all can work together to help put that together, right? Um, if we do not, the fact of the matter is things like COVID is not going to be the end all be all, right? Things like our housing issue will continue to increase. Uh, the our issue around the air that we breathe, the water that we love to play in, those are all things that are that's going to unfortunately become inaccessible or be very limited for many, right? And these are our actual human rights, right? So environmental justice is a human rights issue, right? So not only are we talking about protecting and conserving, but we're also talking about addressing the needs and the just the human rights aspect of lived individuals throughout this country, starting with the our Black and Brown community members. And so if anybody ever wants to have a deeper conversation or want to address other issues, as a representative of Sierra Club, I'm open to do whatever. If you want to talk about it and do something about it, we'll figure out how to make it work. There's partners all across this wonderful state and country who's out here doing this work, and we don't have to think that we're doing it alone.
Thanks so much. Does anyone else, Emmeline?
Yeah, I was just gonna, similar sentiments, and also, if you attend a congregation, you're affiliated with a congregation, or folks who attend a congregation locally who might be interested in engaging on environmental justice issues. If your church maybe already does some work around, let's say, sustainability, anything like that, recycling, because that's part of it. It's a start. It's definitely how we can start engaging folks around climate justice, environmental justice. Please reach out to me. I definitely would love to connect what's going on in the world of faith-based organizations and beyond. We work with community orgs as well. But please reach out to me, and I'd love to connect and also continue having the conversation and see how we can partner, see how we can collaborate, and would love to help you build a team of folks to do this work. So yeah, reach out.
Thank you. I don't know if Maisha or Professor Kanga, I don't know if you have any other concluding thoughts.
I forgot to add something. Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Leah just reminded me. And maybe most of you might have heard of this, but one way to really get your hands, in environmental justice work right now, there is a network of residents, neighborhood folks. It's not a nonprofit. It's a movement. It's called St. Louis Mutual Aid. And there are, networks or pods, what they call, they're place-based where you live. And you probably have one wherever you live, and you can connect with people, build relationships with your neighbors, and help other residents out depending on their immediate essential needs. Like, especially our older folks right now during COVID, with, let's say, transportation sometimes, if you're comfortable with that. Anywhere from, picking up some groceries or some meals and dropping them off for folks. There's also financial solidarity. There's so many ways you can plug in if you're not comfortable going outside and doing those things. There's even ways to do phone calls with folks, checking in on our elderly and folks with disabilities, seeing how folks are doing, trying to connect people to resources. That's a really great way to plug in. I've been working in mutual aid in Jennings. We've built a team at one of our partner organizations. We have volunteer members from that congregation, and we do distributions and deliveries of supplies. It's not just food. We do like bleach. A lot of folks, some of the things that people ask for the most, of course, all of in spring, what was missing in the grocery stores? It was crazy. It's toilet paper, paper towels, bleach, cleaning sprays. Those are the things that we're getting out to community residents. So please look up St. Louis Mutual Aid. It's in the chat.
Thanks so much. Professor Kanga, do you want to say one more thing?
Maisha, I think.
Oh,
Go for it.
go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, I'm one of the co-founders for State Street Tenant Resistance. We organized renters to advocate for themselves and give them support doing so in South St. Louis. On Thursdays and Fridays, we'll be doing some banner making that we will be dropping throughout the city while they should stop eviction and cancel rent. Also, let tenants know what, bullet points of what an illegal lockout is and resources. So we'll be at Perennial. It will be on Saturdays from 11 to 1 and Thursdays from 10 to 12. I will be putting a Facebook event out. Also, for if you know anyone that needs any assistance, are being harassed by the landlord or and someone getting evicted. I also work with the St. Louis Housing Defense Collective, and we have a rapid team that will address that. We're a team of folks that came together and collaborated to have immediate prevention with folks that's facing housing insecurities.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'll just wrap up. And a lot of these environmental justice injustices, they're the result of decades of bad policy and poor decision making, right? And so they can't be solved overnight. And well, I'm happy to be here with these my great co-panelists. These ladies are great, but it can't be up to individuals or even the residents of these communities to solve these issues. A lot of these issues are systemic. And so it's on all of us, academics, students, community members, to advocate for initiatives and policies that address both social needs and these disproportionate environmental hazards. And so that's what I'd like everyone to take away.
Thank you. That was an amazing concluding remark. Thank you all for, especially just thank you to the panelists for joining us. You all shared just such valuable information. I do want to, and Emmeline, you did mention land acknowledgement. I do want to just reiterate the Booter Center we have at WashU. They sent that, I think Alex just sent the land acknowledgement. I think that's really important to remember that we are on these traditional and ancestral lands. And so we need to honor them as we continue to work at Washington University. And I do also want to quickly plug a few events that WUCHIP has, a climate change program has coming up. We have our next speaker series featuring Scott Tinker on November 11th, and we have an upcoming climate conversation on greenwashing. And we'd love for you all to join us as well. And that's on November 17th. You can find all this information on our website, climatechange.worcester.edu. We also just started up a Facebook group and an Instagram. So follow us if you're interested and want to stay updated with our programming. And again, thank you all for joining us. There was just really, really amazing conversation, and I cannot thank our panelists enough for participating and sharing such valuable knowledge. And I think, as the chat seems to show, that a lot of participants are really grateful for what you guys just shared with us. So with that, I hope you all have a good night, and I think that's it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for having us.